Hello everyone and welcome back into another edition here of the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. I, as always, am your host, Christopher Shepard. Thank you all for tuning in on this lovely Thursday afternoon, which I have another great show ahead for you today. Starting off by taking a look at the NBA's top rookies. We're at the midway point of the season thus far, and I want to count down the top 5 rookies thus far in the NBA. They'll be doing our weekly NHL power rankings, see if there are any changes from the first one from last week. Then we're going to be doing a little bit of a belated look at my all-college football playoff team, at least offensively. A lot of great performances to reminisce about there. And then we're going to be continuing our What's Next series for several CFP teams. Today, looking at 3, Tennessee, Clemson, and Georgia specifically. Before we get into any of that fun stuff, I do want to remind you, as always, to like, follow, and subscribe to the network and shows around it if you haven't done so already and want to keep up to date with all our new content. But if you want to contribute and interact with our shows a little bit more directly while we are live streaming, consider making yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube. As always, the best way to get your opinions, feedback, and inputs on air. You can also contribute through our website, gsmcspodcast.net as well. Any tips or donations you decide to leave are genuinely appreciated by all if you feel so inclined, and it just makes the show that much more interactive, but also much better in my opinion, as I get to hear your opinions about the show and not just ramble on about my own most of the time. Without further ado, let's jump right into our first segment of today's show. Let's talk some rookies, specifically in the NBA. Now, a lot of people said that this year's draft was going to be weak. And in many ways, it has proven to be so, because none of the guys in this top 5 list are superstar contributors, much like what Victor Wembanyama has become from last year's draft. But there are still rotational pieces that I feel like can contribute to their teams. They just need to up their traits a little bit that they're lacking in, but also understand their roles a bit better. Others are perhaps outperforming expectations, so to speak. But most of these players, what I find is that all of them really have a defined role that isn't necessarily one that speaks to even contributions night in, night out. They all have a role to play in their squad, so to speak. So no one really stands out as, say, the focal point of this class. No one really stands out as a true superstar, much like what Victor did last year. But all of these guys are incredible athletes in their own right, in their own roles, and they definitely have the space to become superstars, but right now are kind of figuring things out as they go along, and they could be playing on teams not necessarily fit for, forward progress just yet. But without further ado, let's jump right into the top 5 rookies of the season thus far. Starting off at number 5, a young man who I feel like has very high hopes in the San Antonio Spurs team out of UConn. Really interesting point guard in Stephon Castle. He has all the talent. He has all the ability. He has a great motor. I'm very familiar with him from his UConn days, as I watch a lot of Big East basketball as a Xavier fan. So I'm familiar that he has the ability and traits needed to handle one of the most difficult positions at this level. Ultimately, he hasn't necessarily been too efficient, and he definitely drives to the rim a lot more than you would like out of someone on a team really looking to build upon their success this season. And I feel like eventually he becomes someone who gives them some nice floor spacing, the ability to potentially extend his range, but right now he is a very raw product because he has dunked more often than not when in fact he could, take the mid-range shot, find a guy in the perimeter, find a guy down low. So ultimately he needs to work some things into his game, but the good news about him is that he's now a dunk contest participant, and he does have that initial drive to really amp up this young Spurs team, because eventually Chris Paul is not going to be the number one point guard option for you anymore. The Stephon Castle is going to have to step into his shoes. And I think that he can do it, but there definitely are some tweaks he needs to make that will get him to that point. But he sits at number 5 right now, and he definitely could see his star rise in the coming years. Then, at the number 4 spot, a guy who a lot of people were looking forward to in the league, seeing as to how his height could definitely positively impact his play, and that is Mr. Zach Edey. And he has been playing fairly enough basketball to warrant me saying that his first NBA season has been a success, but the Memphis Grizzlies are very deep in their front court. Obviously, we talk about Jaren Jackson Jr. becoming more of a go-to option, much like we did yesterday as we were talking about them on our power rankings, but his minutes often fluctuate in terms of how he plays. He's in a rotation with guys like Brandon Clark, Jay Huff, so he doesn't necessarily see them at action. But when he does, I feel like he's most effective in terms of drawing fouls and being a big presence down low for this Memphis Grizzlies team. I feel like, his physicality is one thing that's going to be tested very often as his career goes on, seeing as to how his height might impact his movement defending more versatile big men, especially a couple nights ago when he was going up against Karl Anthony Towns for a couple of minutes. But I do believe that Zach Edey is more than just a tree down low. He has the skill necessary to draw players into him, and that could definitely help out this very expansive Memphis offense in years to come, in that he can distribute the basketball from down low to their explosive dynamic weapons in the backcourt and ultimately create even more volatility in what's already a very fantastic Memphis offense. So I feel like Zach Edey is going to be a confusing player to monitor over the next couple of years because of the fact that he might not play as often as you would like him to, but he is a very intriguing piece from this class, being the number 9 overall pick. And I feel like because it's Memphis, he'll have a lot of talent around him so that his effectiveness down low doesn't go underrated and underappreciated at that matter. But ultimately, he sits at number 4 on this list. I hope he has a nice end to his rookie season because I think he can see his star rise as well. But then at number 3, another guy down low, big man out of Baylor, playing pretty well considering how the Pelicans season has gone, but not necessarily over the past couple of games. Yves Missi, I think that he is a bright spot for the Pelicans because of what he brings down low and his effectiveness, but I don't necessarily think he's been as efficient as he would like over the recent games, not scoring any points in their last meeting against Dallas. But he is someone who is valued on the boards, both offensively and defensively, very aggressive down low. But I do think that in terms of improvement, I feel like he needs to be more aggressive in terms of second chance points and even on the defensive end, really making sure that the rim is protected. And he's doing a good job of that thus far, but combining it with a little bit more offensive production would certainly help him gain a nicer place in this Pelicans rotation. Because I feel like the Pelicans don't necessarily know who they're relying on, whether it's Zion or his myriad number of injuries, Brandon Ingram, who hasn't necessarily blossomed into the best of second options, and then CJ McCollum, who still has his three-point shot, but can't necessarily be expected to carry this team at his age. So Yves Missi is someone who I feel like has got it down pat defensively, but offensively may need to see some more additions to his game. And so I feel like him and Edey are very similar in that they can provide necessary spacing, but ultimately the reason why I think Missi is a little bit higher is because of his impact in terms of what the Pelicans might need going forward. Because Zach Edey might not be as necessary, quote unquote, to Memphis's rise in the West, whereas Yves Missi definitely is a project who can see his star grow even more should he improve along with this Pelican squad. So I'm really intrigued to see the development of Yves Massy at the number 3 spot. Then the number 2 spot, perhaps the most unexpected of rankings here, the number 39 overall pick out of Washington State, Jalen Wells, also of the Memphis Grizzlies as well. This is a young man who made the most out of his situation, shooting pretty well from 3 at 38.6%. He's very fascinating 3-and-D kind of player, a lot of energy and physicality, but a lot of Memphis people within the organization, his head coach, the front office, a lot of people really love this guy. And I feel like even though his usage might fluctuate a little bit, and he certainly is going to have to struggle to get more minutes, seeing as to how they have a lot of depth in their backcourt, he has made the most of them. And he's definitely guarded some very tough players over the past couple of weeks. And I feel like being able to guard the NBA's best will only see his star rise more as he learns more about himself as the Memphis Grizzlies play tougher and tougher opponents. So I really think that this kid's been a steal at the draft, and I really think his star will ultimately be shining bright for Memphis a couple years down the road when he gets a bigger role in this offense. But the number 1 overall player in this ranking might drop because he's now injured and could miss a significant amount of time. But Alexander Sarr, and he's an interesting case because he's perhaps the worst team out of all these players, and the Washington Wizards certainly need a lot more around him to supplement him. But I do think the best moments we've seen of Sarr are his solidity on the defensive end in terms of leading, I believe, rookies in blocks. He's fascinating at the rim, getting 52% of his shots. But I do feel like he needs the better finishing on the offensive side of the basketball. And right now, his injury status is definitely up in the air as well. They need a Sarr to be healthy if I'm the Wizards, but B, playing significant minutes against these elite teams to get going. So I feel like Sarr, from where he was when he was November's Rookie of the Month to now, we've seen a little bit more inconsistencies, and we're going to have to see how he comes back from this injury. But I really am fascinated by him because out of all these guys, he has the least amount of talent around him and is expected to be the superstar of his team. But right now, he's really struggling. So I could see him drop down these rankings a little bit as the season goes on. But ultimately, I think this is a very well-rounded list. A lot of big men, as it is a big men's league, but also a couple of steals on this list as well, and a couple of guys who just need to iron out the kinks to really get involved with their teams. But ultimately, let me know what you think of the comments below about this list, because coming next, we transition over to the NHL, doing my weekly power rankings there, who will be at number 1 this week, right after this short break.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. Now, before we get into our second segment of today's show, I do want to remind you as always that if you feel so inclined throughout the duration of our show, consider making yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features, as well as our website, gsmcspodcast.net, on our ticker down below here, to better leave opinions, feedback, or input you might have about the show as well, so that I can interact with you, our faithful audience, and those around the network too. I think it's genuinely appreciated by all concerned, no matter what you do for our network, because it just makes our shows that much more lively, that much more interactive, and overall that much better as well. But without further ado, let's jump right into our NHL Power Rankings for this week. A couple of changes here, a couple of teams moving up, a couple of teams maybe moving out, a couple of teams standing pat, but overall, been a very exciting season. A lot of unexpected surprises potentially at the top of these rankings, but also a couple of true Stanley Cup contenders staying pat, staying in the mixture. A couple of teams potentially lurking in the background, the Carolina Hurricanes potentially, after that Mikko Rantanen blockbuster trade, becoming a true Stanley Cup contender and in good form as well. But for right now, this top 5 is what you have for this week. And without further ado, let's just jump right into it. Starting off at number 5, a team definitely in form, picked up its third win in a row in dramatic fashion over another team on this list, a team that's floundering for that matter, but this team certainly is not, and I love how they profile, especially for the postseason, the Dallas Stars. And I really, really love the balance of this team, specifically the youth in this team, but also the depth in this team, the experience they have. Jake Ottinger is a very underrated goaltender, one of the top 5 goaltenders in every statistical category. They have a lot of talent in their youth. Wyatt Johnston, Tyler Harley, an incredible player as well, but also a lot of veterans, Jamie Benn, Miro Heiskanen, who unfortunately, the only caveat in that dramatic win over Vegas a couple of days ago was him going down, but still they have a lot of depth around him. And not only was that win against Vegas after they rallied from 3-1 down to win it on a Wyatt Johnston overtime goal, their third win in a row is their 4th in 5. They're currently 32-12, and I did not necessarily write down their overtime loss record, but they're a hot team in the West. They're gaining ground, and I feel like no one will want to face this team this time around in, say, a conference semifinal round, because last year Oilers were really hot and the Stars kind of ran out of steam at a bad time. But this time around, I feel like the Stars can win a rematch, and we'll talk about that a little bit more as we talk about Edmonton when they're ranked. But ultimately, the Dallas Stars, a pretty incredible team with a lot of incredible depth, and I would not be surprised to see them make a deep postseason run this year and potentially lift the Stanley Cup trophy. And then at number 4, let's talk about their ultimate rivals out west, maybe their biggest rival in terms of getting to the Stanley Cup as the Western Conference representative at this moment in time, as they have gained ground in Vegas in the Pacific Division, the Edmonton Oilers. And the most impressive thing of the Oilers is that they win in regulation a lot. I've seen them do this many a time as an Edmonton Oiler fan. They garner all these regulation wins, and it's truly impressive how many times they either win or lose regulation. They don't have many overtime losses this year or wins at 5 overtime wins and losses, but ultimately they are tied for first since January 1st in terms of 10 regulation wins to date. But what was most impressive is that once that star you see on our screen went down with a suspension, Connor McDavid, they went 2-1-0 without him. That goes to show that they have a little bit more depth to counter all these very loaded, top-heavy Western Conference teams as well. I just feel like a lot of things, though, need to click yet again once they get to the postseason, what they did last year when their defense really shored up. Knobloch was very creative with his lines, but ultimately this Edmonton Oilers team is scary. when all of their stars are clicking. Leon Draisaitl, the leading point scorer in the league right now. Connor McDavid getting on a bit of a roll, getting on a bit of a goal streak yet again. And when Zach Hyman's good and going, Ryan Nugent-Hopkins, the longest tenured Edmonton Oiler. And then this young defense with a guy like Evan Bouchard, who can contribute on both sides very, very well. I feel like this Edmonton team is primed and ready to make another Stanley Cup run. In a couple of weeks, potentially could be the number one team in my rankings. Right now, they're on pace for 115 points, which would match the Toronto Maple Leafs 2020 point total as the highest for a Canadian team in this decade. So, right now, the Edmonton Oilers are pretty hot. Like I said before, they gained ground on Vegas to the point where they've overtaken them in the Pacific Division standings and could see a historic point total for yet another Canadian team this decade. So ultimately, the Oilers are one of the surging teams, not just in the West, but in the entire NHL, and I would not be surprised to see them sit atop these rankings in a couple weeks' time. So congratulations to them, and I think that they really can kick into second gear here on the stretch. They don't have many intimidating games. They do play the Maple Leafs in a couple of weeks, a Canada on Canada showdown. That's a big rivalry, but ultimately, they are playing well within themselves on their own streak, winning in regulation in dramatic fashion. But ultimately, I feel like they have what it takes, yet again, to make magic happen down the stretch. Then let's go to our number 3 team. A lot of people may be mad about their placement on this list, especially seeing as to how they've had a very rough stretch over the past couple of weeks that kind of came to a head against Dallas a couple of days ago, which we already talked about. The Las Vegas Golden Knights. They're currently on a 2-4-2 stretch. They lost momentum in the Pacific Division, and in dramatic fashion, like I continuously say, lost to Dallas Tuesday night in overtime in a painful manner. And I feel like this Vegas Golden Knights team is still one that warrants a placement in the top 5, but I could see how a lot of people are starting to lose a little bit of faith in them. It's mainly because of the goaltending struggles. Adin Hill and Ilya Samsonov are not the best in terms of battery mates between the sticks in the hockey world. And I do feel like when this team is clicking from top to bottom, from the blue line to your centers, I feel like this is one of the best teams in the NHL still. They still have a team identity, much like what we saw them 2 years ago, much like what you saw out of the Panthers last year. And I really like how they profile going into the postseason. Right now, they're in a tough stretch, but I really like all the players on this team. And yes, the goaltending issues are going to have to be figured out and addressed eventually. But for now, this is still a team that can get on a roll. Remember, just this time last week, another team in our rankings, the Winnipeg Jets, were going through a rough stretch. I still had them at number 2, and they've gotten out of it. And they have a chance to prove themselves in a couple of days against Washington. So why can't the Vegas Golden Knights do the same thing? In that, go through a rough patch and then come out on the other side better than ever. And this is a team very well equipped to do just that. So I wouldn't be too worried if I'm a Vegas Golden Knights fan, but I am worried about positioning in the Western Conference standings should Edmonton continue their role and your rough patch continues. Because Edmonton's momentum could see, seeding-wise, the Vegas Golden Knights face a hotter team. Say like a Winnipeg. Say like a Minnesota or something. So I eventually want to see this Vegas Golden Knights get out of this better on the other side, because you don't want to drop too far down the Western Conference standings. But ultimately, I still think they warrant a spot in the top 5 this week, no matter where you think they should be. But let's get into number 2. Let's talk about Winnipeg's resurgence after their own weird switch at the number 2 spot. They have 8 wins in 11. They got a 4-1 win over Montreal Tuesday, and now they are tied with Washington in terms of overall points in the NHL. Obviously, both of them play in different conferences, but still very impressive season from the Jets. Have perhaps the best goaltender of anyone on this list in Connor Hellebuyck. Main reason, guys like Mark Scheifele, Kyle Connor, Blake Wheeler still plying their trade with this team. And like I said, I think our own sports writer Matt Quinn put it best in one of his articles when he described the Winnipeg Jets. They are the San Antonio Spurs in the Greg Popovich era of the NHL this time around. They just slowly go about their business by playing fundamental hockey. It's not necessarily the sexiest, but it gets the job done. And when you have a goaltender like Connor Hellebuyck, who was one of the fastest goaltenders with 300 wins, you can have a guy who's like that between the sticks, then you're as good as gold and you deserve to be where you are. So kudos to them, even though going into the season they were maybe seen as a dark horse contender in the Western Conference. They have emerged as one of the top contenders in the Western Conference. Definitely going to be a struggle in that very loaded Western Conference playoff field, but I think that this Jets team are undaunted just because of who's between the pipes. But they're going up against, in 2 days' time, the number one team in this ranking with another fantastic goaltender to discuss. And I think it's going to be a great game that will test both of these teams' depth and experience. But ultimately, the Winnipeg Jets, number 2, haven't yet usurped the number 1 team. And that is the Washington Capitals. We can talk all we want about Ovechkin continuing to impress in his age 41 season, I believe. We can talk about the physicality of this defense. Tom Wilson still plying his trade, pairing very well with guys like John Carlson and younger defensemen as well. But I want to talk about the rise of, like I said, an unsung goaltender, very underrated in terms of his move from Vegas to Washington, and that is, of course, Mr. Logan Thompson. This season, he is second in goals against average, first in save percentage at .927, and he really has led to the resurgence of this team. It's not just the sum of its parts in the defense and their physicality. It's Logan Thompson between the pipes as well. And it's going to be a fascinating goalie showdown when both Winnipeg and Washington face off against each other in a matter of days. And I really think that could determine the number 1 ranking next week as well. But let me know what you think about this week's rankings. I know a lot of skepticism could be surrounding my Vegas Golden Knights positioning. Maybe seeing as to how hotter teams are looking behind teams like the Stars and Oilers, why not them? But ultimately, I think this top 5 is very fascinating. But coming next, we view a little bit belatedly the all-college football playoff team, specifically on the offensive side of the football. So stick around to see if your favorite stars from the playoff made this list after the break.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search.
Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast. And for our third segment of today's show, we transition to the world of college football, letting it linger a little while longer before all the CFP talk kind of dissipates for a little bit and we transition into more of what's going to happen in the off season. Let's look a little bit at the college football playoff, specifically the players who define it, specifically in the offensive side of the football. CBS Sports did release an all CFP team, and I was eager to examine it and eager to present it to you guys, see what you think about it. So let me know what you think in the comments about all the players on this list, specifically offensively. But without further ado, let's just jump right into it and really analyze this list. Starting off with the QB position, I think it's undoubted who should be the QB of this all CFP team. It is Mr. Will Howard. I don't necessarily think I have a segment here. I'll fix that immediately. Let's talk about Will Howard for a little bit. First ever CFP quarterback to throw for over 1,000 yards. Only Joe Burrow has ever come that close, but ultimately doing it in 4 games will eventually be looked down upon a little bit, but it's still impressive nonetheless because he did it against a team like Oregon, who was formerly the number 1 team in the nation, and against a team like Tennessee, who a lot of people were saying would go on the road and beat up this Ohio State team after that painful loss to Michigan, but he proved them wrong. He had 300 plus yards and 5 passing touchdowns in both of those games, and in a game against Texas where he was going up against a much better defense, he was still very efficient, and he still knew what he had to do and understood the assignment, so to speak. He didn't necessarily force things downfield against this elite Texas secondary, and he really played within himself to the point where their ball control ultimately won them that football game. So, kudos to Will Howard. Yes, in theory, 1,000 yards thrown across 4 games is going to be less impressive than, say, Joe Burrow's stats across 2, but it's still very important to know because that's what could happen in the 12-team playoff. A lot of these quarterbacks who could have been unsung heroes for their teams all season long could suddenly catch fire and eventually, like Will Howard and Ohio State, find themselves winning a national championship. So kudos for him for taking advantage of a quote-unquote second opportunity. Now let's talk about the running back position. We could have had so many running backs. We could have had a guy like Travion Henderson, who, because of Quinshon Judkins, who, hint, hint, is on this all-CFP team, could have made it himself. We could have seen potentially Jaden Blue as an underrated piece on this team, scoring 2 touchdowns in that game against Ohio State, really being one of Texas's best offensive weapons in that game. We could have seen a guy like Quintravion Wisner for that performance against Clemson, but ultimately, Quinshon Judkins and Nicholas Singleton steal the cake here. Take the cake, rather. Now, I mixed up my phrases a little bit. Let's talk about Quinshon Judkins, though, because while Travion Henderson certainly had the more explosive plays, I feel like Quinshon Judkins' performance in the CFP championship game could not go understated. He had 99 yards on the ground, 2 rushing touchdowns, and a receiving touchdown as well, and his versatility really helped this Ohio State red zone offense especially, and really balanced out the explosiveness of the downfield passing game between Howard and his guys, and Buka, Smith, and others as well. And then, in terms of Nicholas Singleton, let's talk about him a little bit. He really was the offensive centerpiece in that game for Penn State against Notre Dame in the CFP semifinal, scoring 3 of their touchdowns and really being very impressive in terms of his versatility as a receiver as well. That's what I think separates them from some other guys on this list, guys like Travion Henderson, who had that big touchdown to end the second half against Texas, but not necessarily influencing the outcome of games both as a rusher and a receiver. So Quinshon Judkins for his performances in critical moments as well as Nick Singleton really take the cake here in my opinion, and they really deserve to have been on this all-CFP team. Obviously, Quinshon Judkins led all running backs, I believe, in touchdowns at 7. Singleton, obviously, his 3 touchdown performance and his big performance against Boise State standing out as well. So really, really standout running backs doing their thing in the all-CFP team. Now let's talk about the wide receiver room here, because really 2 players really define this in big moments for their respective teams, and they're the reason why their respective teams both got to the national championship game. I'm talking about, of course, the ever-impressive Mr. Jeremiah Smith and Jaden Greathouse, the unsung hero of Notre Dame. Let's start off with Jaden Greathouse, though, because Jaden Greathouse did not have a great regular season. In fact, no Notre Dame wide receiver really had a great regular season, as they weren't necessarily a pass-happy team. They lean on the run game, they lean on the physicality, they led with the ground and pound, they led with the aggressive defense that complemented that style of play, and it's ultimately why they got to the national championship game. But it's what Jaden Greathouse did in those 2 games that really elevated Notre Dame's offense when they needed it. Because against Penn State, they looked really, really lackluster for certain portions of this game. And it wasn't until his electrifying 54-yard catch that tied the game up at 24 really gave Notre Dame a shot to win this game in regulation that Notre Dame really found a receiving threat. It was mainly about attacking him on the ground. And speaking of, I just remember that Jeremiah Love could have definitely been one of the running backs selected for this team as well. How important was he to Notre Dame's success? But still, Quinn Judkins and Nick Singleton can't be argued about. We're sticking with Jaden Greathouse here. Jaden Greathouse's stats: 3 touchdowns, 233 yards in the last 2 playoff games are the reason why Notre Dame didn't go down. And I feel like, and didn't go down fighting, specifically in the national title game. And I feel like Jaden Greathouse, no matter who the quarterback next year is going to have a much better regular season. But now let's talk about perhaps the entire MVP of the college football playoff here. A truly special player, or maybe an alien from up above, because we can't really define what this young man can do. Jeremiah Smith is a very special player. He had perhaps the biggest catch of the entire college football season. 3rd and 11, just over 2 minutes to play. You're driving to basically take control of the national championship game. Make sure Notre Dame doesn't get the ball back. And what do? They play man coverage, leave Christian Gray no help up top, and Jeremiah Smith sneaks in behind. That's just what he does. And his 56-yard catch defined that championship game. Without that 56-yard catch, who knows what Notre Dame could have done in the final 2 or so minutes of that game. It could have come back, maybe took it into overtime, and it would have been a different story. But Jeremiah Smith, as he often does, saves the day. His 4-game stat line: 19 catches, 381 yards, 5 touchdowns. And yes, most of those came in the game against Oregon. Most of those came in the game against Tennessee. But still, it's a critical moment, that 56-yard catch on 3rd and 11 to cement your status as a national champion that will stand the test of time. And while it's going to go down as one of the greatest wide receiver performances in a college football playoff, especially in the first ever iteration of a 12-team playoff, specifically seeing as to how it was Ohio State as well, Jeremiah Smith, the fact that this is his freshman season, may never really get this much hype again, which is truly incredible to behold. Think about that. This is a true freshman wide receiver getting this hype. In year 2, it's probably going to be the same, but not a lot of people are going to be, like, oh, wow, this kid is still doing this stuff? That's crazy. It's going to be a little bit more muted, which you can't often say about as talented a player as Jeremiah Smith. But that just goes to show that he truly is a defining player. But look at the versatility of these 2 wide receivers here. Jeremiah Smith, who was great all year, setting freshman records left and right for Ohio State. And then Jaden Greathouse, a guy who did nothing all year in the regular season, really, for this Notre Dame team, but came alive for them in the playoffs. It was a big reason as to why Notre Dame's receiving threat really went underrated in those last 2 games, and really defined what was able to get them there in the first place. But now let's talk about another very, very special player at the tight end position. One of the most special players in all of college football. A do-everything hybrid type of player for Penn State, who really carried them in that CFP semifinal and could have won that game single-handedly if he had to. Tyler Warren, the undisputed Mackey Award winner for nation's best tight end. And to prove his importance to this Penn State team, listen to this. In the entirety of the college football playoff, and there are, I believe, 3 games. No, 4 because they were a wild card. That's right. In 4 games, Drew Aller only threw 3 touchdowns. And while it's a good thing, seeing as to how Nicholas Singleton is on this list as he carried Penn State to the semifinal, Tyler Warren caught 2 of those touchdown passes, and he could have caught more in terms of how he plays. And he's also very flashy in terms of what he can bring in the running game. He had 27 yards on 3 carries, which is pretty impressive for a guy of his physicality and his nature. So it just goes to show a team like Penn State is never too over-reliant, but still, a guy like Tyler Warren can still be the focal point of what they do offensively, and you can't really stop him. And so that's why I really like what this all-CFP team defines. It's a microcosm of how the CFP can go. It's a microcosm of what represented the college football season. And most importantly, it's a team of second chances. A lot of these guys probably would not have gotten another opportunity in a 4-team format, especially these Ohio State guys and the Notre Dame guys for that matter. But ultimately, that's what makes this 12-team playoff so special. It gives all these unsung players another chance. Should they, much like in the 4-team playoff, have had a chance to miss out. So that's what makes this special, and I really wanted to present it to you guys, even now as we're approaching the 2-way mark of being removed from the CFP championship game. But coming up next, we're continuing with the college football theme in our 4th segment, looking at what could potentially be next for one of the SEC's elite Tennessee Volunteers. We're going to be talking about what they need to do to rebuild and retool potential another CFP appearance under Josh Heupel. We'll be right back after this short break.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere.
Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. And for our 4th segment of today's show, we're going to be continuing our quote-unquote What's Next series, talking about all 12 CFP teams and what they need to do to get back to this spot next season. And we're going to be talking about one of the more bizarre ones, the Tennessee Volunteers, because I really don't necessarily know how to define this Tennessee Volunteers team yet. Are they just a solid SEC team who got by with a pretty easy schedule and whose only notable win was Alabama at home? Or are they truly an elite college football team? We'll have to find out in 2025 because I don't think many questions were answered in that department in 2024. But what I can tell you is that another year of Nico Iamaleava at the helm for this offense, and the fact that they can definitely find new pieces to rebuild this defensive line after guys like James Pierce Jr. have left, and then also diagnose what they can do to revitalize this passing game, they have a chance to build on what could be seen as a very successful season. Because think about this. This Tennessee team, I think their main problem is, yes, they're losing a lot of depth, but they haven't had a signature win in many different attempts, especially on the road. We'll talk about what they're going to have to face on the road this season after we recap what they've been doing this off-season. But ultimately, I feel like this Tennessee team, in order to truly be appreciated for reaching the CFP, have to achieve it in an impressive manner. What I mean by that is they can't just skate by getting the easy wins, getting to that 10-win threshold, and not necessarily looking dominant while doing it. They have to be dominant. They have to, therefore, find players who are dominant in their own right. So that's what I think needs to define the rest of this offseason, even though they've already done pretty well for themselves in retooling for next year. So let's talk about what they've been doing thus far. Obviously, before we do any of that, we have to recap their season. Pretty impressive season. Obviously, beating Alabama, pretty big win, but ultimately not being able to beat Georgia and teams of that magnitude, and then getting boat raced on the road at Ohio State when a lot of people were picking you to win that game, definitely did not leave a good mark in the minds of all the Tennessee fans down there. But the good news is that your quarterback in his third year, second as the starter, Nico Iamaleava, returns and has a chance to develop. Obviously, one major thing of note for Nico is how he looks against the elite teams, because his best performances were against FCS schools like Samford, and that's not going to cut it against teams like Georgia, Alabama, Texas if you have to face them down the line in your career. But ultimately, the fact that he's returning, the fact that he's continuing to learn and mature, and the fact that Josh Heupel is his coach and he really loves investing in quarterbacks who can mature and develop like he did with Hendon Hooker in his career, I feel like Nico has a definite chance of growth next season. But ultimately, let's talk about the production they are losing on that side of the football, because they are losing a very important cog in their offensive line, and Cooper Mays, who is definitely defined as one of the heartbeats of that team, not just offensively, but for the entire identity and culture of this Tennessee Volunteers football team. And then one of the most underrated backs, potentially one of the best backs in the SEC at the very least, Dylan Sampson, losing a lot of yards from him, and you're going to have to find a way to replace him. But ultimately, I feel like where they were lacking was in the passing game. Nico, for large portions of this season, didn't necessarily develop a ton of rapport with his receivers. Obviously, there's a lot of hope surrounding guys like Squirrel White and Brew McCoy, but they hadn't really separated themselves over the course of that season. But ultimately, I feel like there could be some guys that emerge, quote-unquote. Mike Matthews, the rising sophomore, former 5-star, has a chance to step up into a bigger role. Because ultimately, Nico hasn't necessarily thrown for that many yards against elite teams. In fact, he's only passed for more than 200 yards against an FBS opponent 4 times in 13 career starts this season. But then I think about this Tennessee team, and then I start to think about, well, what about this defense? Because at least the offense is returning its starting quarterback, and there's an opportunity for these young guys to really step up. But the defense did lose potentially one of the better prospects in this year's draft in James Pierce, and now they're going to have to rebuild. And though their defensive line coach is fantastic at diagnosing new talent, they're definitely going to have to start thinking about who's going to really bolster this offensive line, whether it be some of their recruits or through the transfer portal as well. They've already done very good work in terms of diagnosing that area of need in terms of the recruiting trail and the transfer portal as well. Let's start off with the recruits that will define this 2025 class for the Tennessee Volunteers, starting off by the defensive tackle, the number 3 defensive tackle in the ESPN 300, number 38 overall prospect, Isaiah Campbell. He could definitely help lead this defensive line retool. And then on the offensive side of the football, to kind of compensate for the loss and accommodate for the loss of a guy like Cooper Mays, they bring in the number 5 recruit in the ESPN 300, David Sanders, at the offensive tackle position, and ultimately wraps up the highest ranked class of the Josh Heupel era. And ultimately, that's good for the allure of Tennessee, because that means players want to play for not just Heupel, to play for a guy like Nico Iamaleava, who they believe in and invest in, and play for the defensive line coach, who is known for getting the most out of a guy like James Pierce Jr. So that's a very good thing. In terms of the transfer portal, they haven't really done much in terms of defensively. I feel like Tennessee loves to build things defensively from the ground up. But ultimately, I feel like one major hole in their rebuild that they need to fill is obviously getting as much offensive tackle help as they need. And they did it with David Sanders through a recruiting trail, but ultimately signing a guy like Wendell Moe, who was a freshman All-American last year, will definitely help. He's a 26-game starter at left guard. Actually, he's a sophomore. My mistake. And the Vols certainly need as much guard help as possible, as well as they are losing 3 guards to potentially draft. So ultimately, Wendell Moe addresses an area of need. But let's talk about, how this Tennessee team is going to struggle next year. Because, like I said, the ultimate goal for Tennessee isn't necessarily just winning on the recruiting path or in the transfer portal and diagnosing area of needs. It's winning on the football field when it matters. Like I said, the Vols have lost 22 straight to top 10 opponents on the road. And it's really a shame because this Tennessee team really thinks that they can find talent, invest in it, watch that talent grow, mature, and it's what they're doing with this team right now. They're investing in Nico, they're finding guys in the recruiting trail they believe they can build up, and they're relying on their head coaching staff to really find pieces, much like James Pierce Jr. on the defensive side of the football, to step up on both sides as well. But it's not going to matter if you can't put out a good product week in, week out in the SEC. Because Nico and this offense can click against every FCS opponent they wish. But until they can do it against the Alabamas, the Texases, the Georgias, the potentially Floridas, the South Carolinas of the world, I feel like it's going to be all for naught. And yes, a CFP appearance is fine and dandy, but I want a team that proves it to me, that proves that they are among the top 12 teams in the nation. Because Tennessee, had an impressive win against Alabama, but it wasn't necessarily enough for me to say that they should have been one of the top 12 teams in the nation. A lot of these other schools in the SEC had way more impressive wins in my opinion. Yes, they lost more games, but way more impressive wins. It did it in dominating fashion. Tennessee didn't necessarily dominate in many different aspects of all their games against top 10 opponents. And that's one thing that they have to diagnose. And speaking of their schedule, they're going to have to do it on the road. They get road tests against Florida, against Bama, both teams who are looking to be very much improved. Florida, obviously, with DJ Lagway. Alabama, maybe going to be looking more dangerous in the second year of the Kalen DeBoer era after a disappointing first season there. And then they get Georgia at home. So it's definitely not going to be easy sledding here for Tennessee. They're going to have to find ways to stack top 10 wins, and I believe in Nico and Josh Heupel to do so. The question is, do any of these players coming in have it in them to be willing to invest into the culture that Tennessee is building? Because if they do, this can be a very, very special team. But if they don't, then I really think Tennessee's in danger of just becoming another humdrum SEC team. But let me know what you think about this Tennessee team that Collins. Very interesting team to analyze. But coming up next to conclude today's show, we're talking about another interesting team to analyze in terms of the CFP. It's Clemson. What will their future look like? Will Dabo Swinney finally get a little bit more ambitious in his decisions? We'll find out right after this short break. Hello everyone and welcome back into the final segment of today's show here in the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast. And for our final segment, we'll be looking at yet another college football playoff team, this time the number 12 seeded team that kind of snuck in to the CFP as the ACC champion, the Clemson Tigers. And out of all these programs, Clemson is the one with the most questions about its elite status, even more so than, say, Tennessee, because they're not a traditional modern college football team. Dabo Swinney is still at the helm, and he's still doing things his way, going old school, not relying on transfer portal additions as much as other big head coaches, and really relying on what he has in-house. But this year, things might have to change, because you're losing a lot of talent, especially on the defensive side of football where you're known to make your hay, but ultimately, you're also losing credibility, because, as we'll find out, Clemson's recruiting class is not as talented as it once was in years past for Dabo. In fact, it's fallen behind schools such as Duke and Syracuse in terms of the ACC recruiting rankings. And then in terms of wins, he didn't have many signature ones last year, and if it weren't for a last-second win over SMU in the ACC championship game, you were on the outside looking in, and it's quite clear as to why. He got drubbed at home to Georgia. No, wait, it was a neutral site, but still, got drubbed by Georgia week 1 of the season. At home to Louisville, you fell, and then you lost to rival South Carolina in heartbreaking fashion and let Lenora Sellers run all over you. And then, in the game against Texas, your differences between an elite college football team were made quite clear. So, I feel like Clemson has a lot more problems to answer and problems to solve than other CFP teams, because this is more of a credibility issue rather than anything that can really be fixed by any players, even though a lot of in-house talent returns and they're at the point in their careers where they really are stellar football players. So ultimately, Clemson's quote-unquote rebuild is going to be a lot tougher to really analyze as the offseason goes on, because I really don't know what they're going to do, even though they already have gone outside of tradition a little bit. We'll talk about that later. But ultimately, here's what needs to happen for Clemson in terms of how they need to change some of their philosophies and get some players into this program they actually can build around outside of maybe some in-house options who are going to be leaving you now. But let's start off with the good. Obviously, Cade Klubnik, after a career resurgence of sorts in his second year under Garrett Riley, really helping him in that regard, and something to look out for in their connection next season, is returning. And that's something that's very important to Dabo, building up quarterbacks, giving them 3 to 4 years in this program, and ultimately Cade Klubnik coming back really cements him as a quarterback to watch, not just in terms of the ACC, not just in terms of the entire college football landscape, but from the top quarterbacks in the 2026 NFL Draft. He really is perhaps the most experienced quarterback returning outside of, say, Carson Beck in college football next season. And with it, he brings a career year. Definitely not the reason they lost to Texas on the road in that CFP game, and definitely one of the bright spots offensively for this Clemson offense this year. Really made the most out of definitely one of the thinner receiving cores in the CFP, as we saw in that game against Texas as well. And then look at guys on the defensive side of the football in TJ Parker and Peter Woods, who are truly fantastic contributors, and a guy like Sammy Brown, who in his freshman year really impressed at the linebacker position. And you really are bringing back a lot of talent in-house if you're Dabo Swinney, who you can be pleased with and really want to continue this Clemson philosophy of building through who you already have. And I really respect that. But what's also interesting this offseason is that Clemson is actually getting a head start in the transfer portal. And this is really intriguing to me, because I feel as if Clemson wants to go into the season every year, look at who they have, and really say, okay, this is the infrastructure we're working with. Rarely do they say, well, we might need some outside help and we might be looking for portal additions. But Dabo Swinney has finally dipped his feet into the transfer pool, and they've gotten some decent additions here. Granted, only 2 of them so far, and they don't necessarily stand out as, say, some other college football playoff teams transferred that they've been able to acquire, but it's still something of note because Clemson is actually doing something proactive in terms of the transfer portal. So I feel like because of that, Clemson is already showing promise in terms of its thoughts for the future, and realizing that they might be losing college football credibility in the entire landscape of things right now. But the fact that they're diagnosing it, analyzing it, and actually going for help speaks volumes for how this team can evolve. Because I feel like if they already have such a good infrastructure, with the players they already have, combining it with players willing to play for your program, willing to transfer to your program, that just creates a stronger bond, a stronger connection between these players. And that's what Dabo Swinney preaches. And the fact that he's able to find players who want to play for him still, despite his archaic philosophies, I feel like is quite profound and something that could be interesting to monitor and see pan out as the season plays out down the stretch. Ultimately, let's talk about these 2 transfers, and then we'll get into a little bit of the recruiting trail because that's an important thing for Clemson as well. Will Helt comes over from Purdue, pass rusher, guy that I think that really could bolster an already very deep defensive front for the Clemson Tigers. And then into the wide receiver help, as obviously you don't necessarily have too much talent outside of guys like TJ Moore and Bryant Wesco, who you're really hoping will develop after pretty solid freshman seasons. And Tristan Smith, a guy at the FCS level coming out of Southeast Missouri State, had a 900-yard year at the FCS level already. I feel like, yes, both of these players are very risky, not necessarily the most high-profile transfers you could have gotten, but it's still something. And I feel like Dabo is starting to realize that, hey, there are positions that might need some help. There are areas of need that might need replenishing. And if I can do that through the portal, then chances are this team can even become a lot more connected in terms of who we have and who is coming in, and create a different atmosphere, a different culture that could cultivate success. And so, while these guys might not necessarily be the biggest contributors, they speak volumes about what Clemson could become in the future, even if Dabo Swinney's not a part of it. And then let's talk about the recruiting trail, because I feel like that kind of speaks volumes about Clemson's loss of luster, so to speak, in that department. This is where I think Clemson will really struggle in the years to come, the recruiting trail, because younger prospects might not buy into Dabo Swinney's philosophies. And that's where Clemson really have struggled. Like I said, in terms of the ACC recruiting rankings, they're 7th, which is nowhere near where a team like Clemson wants to be. But in terms of a solid recruit they have gotten, Gideon Davis, who truly is one of the better running backs, number 3 running back prospect in this class, is a massive addition, because you're losing one of the great Clemson running backs of all time in Phil Maffa, losing his 1,100 yards in the back. But Gideon Davidson had a great senior season, over 2,000 yards, 34 touchdowns last season. But ultimately, someone who can really rejuvenate this offense, diversify the backfield even more for a guy like Cade Klubnik, who would really appreciate it, seeing as to how he might want to see his dual threat abilities come to fruition a little bit more. But ultimately, a great addition in what could prove to be a very lackluster class, so to speak. But now let's talk about Clemson and what they need to do in order to maintain their credibility, so to speak. Their schedule is not as difficult as last year's. They get most of their non-conference opponents, teams like LSU, who are playing their first game of the season, and South Carolina at home now. But they could have some ACC trip-ups. They play Georgia Tech. I believe they play Syracuse, teams who are going to build on strong seasons, returning pretty strong quarterbacks in King and McCoy respectively. So ultimately, Clemson's goal this season, even though they're not playing all these high-profile teams like the Georgias and South Carolinas of the world, well, they are playing South Carolina, but not a team like Georgia, but ultimately making sure they don't slip up even more. And what I've seen out of what they've been building is this very intriguing way of developing and relying upon subsequently certain players and what they mean for the program. If you look at what I've just told you and define that on what Clemson is going to look like this season, you'll probably say they're going to look like a team that's a pretty cohesive unit, but might struggle in terms of finding a true identity, so to speak. Because this is uncomfortable territory to the point where young recruits don't necessarily want to come play for you. And seeing as to how this could be Kay Klubnik's, Peter Woods, TJ Parker's last seasons, you're going to want to find some young talent quickly. Yes, you have a very young receiving core, but you're going to want to find these young prospects. And that's something that's going to be a challenge for them. So maybe if Dabo continues to dip in the portal this year, you can find a culture where some more in-house guys who are going to be asked to step up in years to come really step into the limelight. And I like that for what I think Clemson could become, which is a team that, yes, is going to look a little bit more old school than other elite programs, but still has a defined identity in terms of how they want to build from the ground up, if that makes sense. But let me know what you think about this Clemson team in the comments below. A very interesting team as well to analyze, along with a team like Tennessee. But that will just about do it for today's edition of the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. I've been your host, Christopher Shepard. Thank you all for tuning in. We'll be back to conclude the week tomorrow at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Like, follow, and subscribe if you haven't already. If you want to keep up to date with all content around the network, continue to make yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube, as well as our podcast network website, gsmcspodcast.net, to leave any tips or donations as well if you feel so inclined. But other than that, I am out for today, and I will be back tomorrow.